The inventory of sins begins not with a crime, but with a mirror. In the final years, the reflection was a stranger's. A porcelain effigy with haunted eyes, assembled from fragments of a boy who was never allowed to exist. This was the anatomy of his fall. A slow-motion self-erasure performed under the brightest lights in the world. The world saw a pop idol chasing an unnatural ideal. They were wrong. He was running from a ghost, the ghost of a father's face, a father's voice calling him Big Nose. Each surgical procedure was not an act of vanity. It was an exorcism, a desperate, bloody attempt to carve Joseph Jackson out of his own DNA. The public saw a mutilated fate. He saw the only escape route. He built a new face like a fortress, but the enemy was already inside. A long, enveloping sentence to set the mood. Then, the staccato. The first cut wasn't from a surgeon's blade. It was from a father's word. A wound that never healed. This relentless pursuit of a different face was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a childhood spent in the meat grinder of fame, where love was conditional and approval was measured in record sales. He wanted to become so unrecognizable that even his own memories wouldn't know him. He wanted to be a blank slate, a perfect white canvas. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a testament to the fact that you cannot escape your own biography. The verdict was written on his face long before the final pause autopsy. Neverland was not a home. It was a bunker. A gilded fortress built to keep the world and adulthood itself at bay. 2,700 acres of manufactured innocence, complete with a private zoo and an amusement park that never closed. It smelled of cotton candy and deep, profound loneliness. This was his bitter testament to a childhood that was stolen from him, a desperate attempt to buy back the years he'd spent working under the cold gaze of his father. He filled his gilded cage with laughter, with children. He thought their innocence could shield him from his own darkness. A fatal mistake. The world outside doesn't understand purchase purity. It sees only the transaction. The gates he opened to create a sanctuary became the entry point for suspicion, for lawyers, for the cameras that would turn his fantasy into a potential crime scene. The empire of make-believe began to crumble. The laughter faded. The silence that followed was deafening. The true price of Neverland wasn't the millions it cost to maintain. The price was trust. He invited the world to see the boy who refused to grow up, and the world put that boy on trial. The wreckage of his empire wasn't the abandoned rides or the empty enclosures. It was the idea that innocence could be preserved. It can't. It can only be lost. Neverland stands today as a monument to that truth, a digital coffin for a dream that became a pause nightmare. Neverland was not a home. It was a diagnosis, rendered in wrought iron and topiaries. A 2,700-acre monument to a stolen childhood, built with the profits of an adult's relentless genius. The gates, gilded and impossibly ornate, were designed to keep the world out. In the end, they simply locked him in. Inside this gilded cage, a private amusement park spun silently for an audience of one. A zoo housed exotic animals that were arguably less captive than their owner. It was a kingdom built on loneliness, populated by the ghosts of what should have been. Pause. He wanted to be Peter Pan, the boy who refused to grow up. But the world does not grant such wishes. Not when they are funded by a billion-dollar empire and scrutinized by a billion eyes. The laughter of visiting children, a sound he craved, became the soundtrack to his profound isolation. He was the host, the benefactor, the king, and the loneliest man in the park. Then the whispers began. The kind of whispers that travel on the wind and poison the soil. They turned his candy-coated sanctuary into a potential crime scene. The dream curdled into a public nightmare. The fantasy became Exhibit A in the televised trial of his character. Police convoys replaced children's parties. The Ferris wheel stood motionless against the California sky, a silent witness to the anatomy of a fall. Every dollar poured into this manufactured innocence became a crushing liability. The ranch, once the ultimate symbol of success, began to bleed him dry, a financial hemorrhage that mirrored the draining of his public goodwill. Neverland wasn't just a place on a map. It was the final tragic stage for a man-child, a poisoned Eden from which there was no real escape. The gates that once promised a magical paradise now sealed a very lonely tomb. Acute propofol intoxication. The king of pop had been anesthetized into eternity by the very hands hired to keep him alive. The world didn't get the comeback they paid for. They got a verdict. The legacy was immortal, but the man was gone, a final, tragic casualty in the meat grinder of fame. Cauterize the wound with money before it bled out in public. But the fire of cash doesn't cleanse. It brands. He purchased silence, but the cost was the presumption of innocence. It was a fatal miscalculation, an act of crisis management that became a permanent crisis of legacy. The sum, a reported $22 million, was not just a payment, it was a ghost that would forever haunt his balance sheet. This wasn't a verdict from a jury box, it was a price tag on doubt, and the world saw him pay it without flinching. The machine built to protect him had instead constructed the first wall of his prison. From this moment on, every child he helped, every hand he held, would be viewed through the grimy lens of that settlement. The king was still on his throne, but the throne itself was now tainted. The bitter testament was written not in a will, but on a check. Defendant number G, a 48812. Each day he walked to the courthouse a specter in silk and sunglasses. His body withered, his face a porcelain mask cracking under the weight of scrutiny. The media, a pack of hyenas, tore into the carcass of his myth. Neverland was reimagined as a predator's lair. His eccentricities, once charming, were now presented as evidence of pathology. The prosecution conducted a posthumous audit of his life while he was still living. The verdict came. Pause. Not guilty. On all 10 counts, a hollow victory. The gavel's sound was a whisper against the hurricane of public opinion. He was legally exonerated, but socially executed. He won his freedom, but lost his kingdom. The trial was the final, brutal act in the dismantling of his identity. It stripped away the last vestiges of magic, leaving only a broken man who could no longer find refuge, not even in his own reflection. He left the courthouse a free man, but he was exiled from the world he had created. Pause. The sentence was life, in a prison of his own fame. The autopsy of a legacy is a bloodless affair, conducted not with a scalpel, but with a script. In 2026, they will attempt to resurrect Michael Jackson, building him a monument of light and sound titled simply Michael. A final, definitive statement. But this resurrection comes with a fatal condition, a ghost haunting the machine. A gag order signed in blood money decades ago. A contract that dictates what parts of the soul are permitted for public viewing. This is the anatomy of a posthumous edit. The film is the estate's ultimate gambit to seize control of the narrative, an act of image management from beyond the grave. Jackson himself was the original master of this dark art, meticulously crafting a persona of childlike innocence while his world grew darker, more complex, more isolated within the gilded cage of Neverland. His success smelled of manufactured stardust and the cold, hard concrete of the courtroom steps he would come to know so well. Now, the new architects of his legacy, a nephew Jafar, bearing his uncanny likeness, a director, Antoine Fuqua, known for portraits of compromised men, and lawyers, always the lawyers, with binders full of secrets, are tasked with finishing his life's most ambitious project, his own myth. They are the custodians of the legend, and their job is to polish the marble while ignoring the cracks. Pause. Their primary obstacle is a ghost, the ghost of 1993. The Jordan Chandler settlement was more than a financial transaction. It was a narrative poison pill, a contract that bought silence at the price of permanent suspicion. The terms of that bitter testament are absolute, its power reaching across decades to bind the hands of the storytellers. The family cannot be named. The events cannot be depicted. This legally mandated amnesia forces the filmmakers to write around a black hole at the center of their universe, a wound so deep it cannot be shown, only felt in its conspicuous absence. The result is a sanitized gospel, a story of genius and tragedy, but with the most damning chapter surgically, brutally removed. This polished narrative stands in stark, silent opposition to the raw, festering wound of Leaving Neverland, the documentary that serves as the prosecution's closing argument in the court of public opinion. One is a theme park ride through a curated kingdom. The other is a guided tour of its ruins. The biopic is not a search for truth. It is an inventory of sins carefully edited for mass consumption. It is the final, gleaming nail in a digital coffin designed to be beautiful, impenetrable, and forever sealed on the inconvenient truths within. What the estate fails to grasp is that the erasure is the story. The silence they purchased is now the loudest part of his legacy. The film will be a spectacle, a monument to the king of pop, but it will be a hollow monument, haunted by the specter of what is not said, what cannot be said. The world will watch, and they will see the genius, the music, the singular dance. But they will also feel the void, the cold draft coming from the redacted pages of his life, the dark matter of a catastrophic compromise. The final verdict on Michael Jackson will not be delivered by a film critic or a box office receipt. It was already written in the fine print of a non-disclosure agreement. Pause. His true bitter inheritance is not the music. It is the doubt.